somewhere past the edge of charted space, a young man was screaming into a radio that was already dying, and the last thing he expected was for anyone to answer. He was right not to expect it. Almost nobody did. But this is the story of what happened when somebody finally did, and why, generations from now, 4 words would still make hardened warlords go quiet. Humanity heard the call. If that gives you chills, hit like and subscribe before we get into it, because you don't want to miss where this one goes. Now, let's rewind to the beginning. Elowen's Reach was not a place anyone fought over. It had no valuable ore buried in its crust, no position guarding a trade lane worth mentioning. What it had was water, an entire planet of it, broken only by chains of floating cities anchored to reefs of bioluminescent kelp that the Ithra had spent 4 centuries cultivating into the basis of half the medicine used across a dozen neighboring systems. The Ithra themselves were an unhurried people by nature, pale-finned and slender, who communicated as much through the shifting color of their skin as through speech, and who had never once needed a standing military, because nobody had ever given them a reason to build one. Their kelp glowed on its own, a soft blue-green wash that lit the underside of every floating concourse at night, and for a long time visiting traders assumed it was decorative, some cultivated aesthetic the Ithra had bred into their reefs for beauty's sake. It wasn't. The light came from a chemical reaction, a protein called luciferin reacting with oxygen inside specialized cells, the same basic trick used by fireflies and deep-sea fish back on Earth, just scaled up across an entire planet's worth of reef. The Ithra had simply noticed, centuries earlier, that the compounds their glowing kelp produced to regulate that light also happened to be extraordinary at regulating human and Ithra cell repair. A whole medical industry had been built on top of something that had first evolved simply, so a plant could be seen in the dark. The Korrath Swarm gave them a reason to build a military in about 11 minutes. Nobody ever agreed on what to call the Korrath. Pirates undersold them. Empire overstated them. What the swarm actually was a loose federation of scavenger ships bolted together from 100 different wars, crewed by whoever was hungry enough to fly them, all of it coordinated by drones that got smarter every time somebody tried to fight back. They hadn't come to conquer Elowen's Reach. They'd come to strip it, kelp processors, fabrication plants, anything with resale value, and they didn't much care what happened to the people standing in the way. Emrik Thal was 26 and had never been trained for a night like this one. He worked hydro systems maintenance on the outer concourse, which meant that when the swarm's opening barrage cracked one of the dome's support struts, he was close enough to hear it happen, and close enough, 20 minutes later, to be standing in a flooding maintenance shaft with water already at his knees, trying to get the emergency beacon working with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The beacon wasn't built for this. It was meant for reef breaches and equipment failures, small local emergencies, not for broadcasting into the dark to whoever might be listening. But Emrik didn't know what else to do, so he opened every channel the little unit had and started talking, and kept talking even as the water climbed past his waist, because it felt better than the alternative, which was standing there in silence, waiting to drown. What Emrik didn't know, what almost nobody outside a communications lab would have known, was that his beacon wasn't only carrying his voice. Emergency units like his were built to piggyback a second, quieter signal underneath the words. A thin stream of biotelemetry, heart rate, oxygen levels. The raw data a rescue team could use to triage a wounded caller before they even arrived. It was designed to save maybe 30 seconds during a routine reef accident. That night, it would end up saving an entire world. The water was at his chest by the time the beacon finally locked onto a working relay. He could hear the concourse groaning above him, metal fatigue talking in long, low creaks, and somewhere further down the shaft, a bulkhead gave way with a sound like a held breath finally let go. Emrik kept one hand on the beacon and one hand on the ladder rung above him, and he did not stop talking, not when his voice cracked, not when the water reached his collarbone, not even when he ran out of things to say and simply repeated the only sentence that still felt true. Please. Somebody. Please. He had no way of knowing that 11 light years away, a woman he would never meet was about to hear exactly that word and take it seriously. The signal did what distress signals always did first. It went exactly where it was supposed to G. Oh, it hit a relay buoy at the edge of the Elowen system within minutes, then moved through the careful, well-maintained architecture of the Covenant of Free Worlds communication network, exactly the way 400 years of deliberate engineering had designed it to move. It landed, eventually, on the desk of an undersecretary named Calyx Thorn. Thorn wasn't cruel or even especially cold. He'd built a long career inside the Covenant by being reliable, and reliability, in an organization stitched together from 41 member species who had all agreed, centuries earlier, that the fastest way to start a war was to let any one of them act alone, meant following the process. Elowen's Reach wasn't a Covenant member. It had no treaty on file, no formal request for aid, and no seat at any table that could authorize a response. Thorn read the report, confirmed nothing about its handling had been irregular, and forwarded it to the appropriate subcommittee for review. The subcommittee would meet in 6 days. There's a piece of wisdom that shows up in nearly every real emergency response manual ever written. The first 3 days after a disaster decide how many people walk away from it. Search and rescue teams build their entire operating tempo around that window, because once it closes, survival odds fall off a cliff. The Covenant had built an institution that could reliably convene the right people to make the right call in roughly 14 times that window. It wasn't stupidity. It was caution, calcified over generations. The Covenant had avoided wars for centuries by refusing to let anyone move quickly, and on balance, that had probably saved more lives than it had ever cost. Thorn believed that. He'd believed it for 30 years, ever since a border dispute early in his career had nearly spiraled into open conflict because one member state had launched ships before the rest of the coalition had a chance to agree on anything. Process had prevented that war. Process, Thorn told himself, was not the enemy. It was the reason 41 different species with 41 different histories of grievance hadn't torn each other apart the moment they'd started sharing a table. But process had never been tested against a stopwatch quite like this one, and some quiet part of him already suspected it would fail the test badly. He just found himself, that particular evening, sitting very still at his desk, staring at a transcript with a young man's voice cracking in the middle of it, and wondering, not for the first time, whether the math ever changed depending on whose life sat on the other side of it. He marked the file urgent, which changed nothing procedurally, though it did mean the file would be read first at the subcommittee meeting, 6 days from now, by people who would almost certainly agree that something ought to have been done sooner. He marked it urgent and went home. Listening post-oral sat at the far edge of human-charted space, a squat gray station whose entire purpose was cataloging the galactic background noise. Nobody else wanted to bother with old wreckage beacons, decayed transmissions, the electromagnetic litter of a few hundred civilizations. It was not, by any measure, an exciting posting. Petty Officer Wren Callahan had the graveyard rotation the night the signal reached Oral, so faint that the automated filters nearly logged it as noise and moved on. Signals lose strength fast. Intensity falls off with the square of the distance traveled, which meant whatever Emrik Thal had shouted into his little beacon had been diluted 1,000,000 times over by the time a fragment of it brushed Oral's receivers. What was left barely qualified as a voice. Callahan almost let it go. She had 6 other flagged transmissions in the queue and a coffee going cold beside her console, and Oral had taught her, over 3 years of quiet rotations, that 99% of what drifted through her sensors was exactly as boring as it looked. But something in the waveform snagged her attention before the translator had even finished its pass, a raggedness to it that didn't match the clean cadence of a routine beacon. She pulled up the raw frequency plot and noticed the shift immediately. A slight drift in pitch across the recording that had nothing to do with the translator and everything to do with basic physics. The same Doppler effect that makes a passing ambulance siren seem to drop in pitch as it moves away, except here it meant the source had been moving fast relative to whatever relay first caught it. Someone recording this hadn't been standing still. They'd been running or falling or drowning. She ran it again, cleaned the filters, ran it a 3rd time, and this time the translation resolved enough to make out actual words underneath the static. A world under attack, a plea for anyone at all. There's a reason that particular kind of sound is hard to ignore, even filtered through bad audio and a machine translator. Researchers studying empathy have spent decades documenting why the sound of another creature's distress reliably produces a physical reaction in listeners. A tightening in the chest, a spike in attention, long before the listener has consciously decided to care. It runs deeper than language, which is likely why Callahan's hands were already moving toward the escalation protocol before her brain had finished processing what she'd heard. She pulled the star charts, found the origin point, and felt her stomach drop. Elowen's reach wasn't Covenant territory. It wasn't anyone's territory that mattered to the chain of command she answered to. By every rule she'd ever trained under, it wasn't her problem. She flagged it urgent anyway, attached her own note. This is a distress call, someone is dying. We should not sit on this, and sent it up the line before she could talk herself out of it. Then she sat back in her chair and did something she rarely allowed herself on a quiet shift. She played the recording a fourth time, not to analyze it, just to listen. She thought about how close it had come to being logged and forgotten, one more scrap of noise in a queue that never really emptied. She thought about every operator on every listening post across every allied species who might have gotten the same fragment first and simply moved on to the next item on the list. Because that was the job, and the job had rules, and the rules didn't leave much room for a hunch. She was glad, in a way she couldn't fully explain, that the rules had happened to route it to her instead. It took less than 40 minutes for the message to reach Fleet Admiral Corwin Blake, 3 systems away, aboard the command carrier UES Vanguard. Blake was 54, broad through the shoulders, and known among his crew for a habit of making decisions once and not revisiting them. He listened to the recording all the way through without interrupting, and when it ended, he sat quietly for a moment, studying the jagged spike in the waveform where Emrik Thal's voice had cracked, and the long, flat silence that followed it. "It's not our jurisdiction, sir," his executive officer, Commander Alara Finch, said, though there wasn't much conviction behind it. "Not a treaty world. The Covenant will get to it eventually." "Eventually," Blake repeated, turning the word over like it tasted wrong. "You know the first real rule of emergency response, Alara. Doesn't matter if it's a house fire or a war. Whoever decides fastest with the information they've got wins, not whoever decides best. Whoever decides fastest and keeps adjusting." It was an old idea, one military strategists had taught for generations. Observe, orient, decide, act, and do it quicker than the situation can change on you. The Covenant had built an institution that excelled at the deciding part, and moved catastrophically slowly through everything around it. "We won't wait on them," Blake said, already turning toward the command display. "Get me Captain Raina Osai. Tell her I want the response group ready to burn within the hour." Finch didn't argue further. She'd served under Blake long enough to know that once his mind was made up, debate only slowed things down, and slowing down was exactly what he refused to do. She turned instead to the readiness board and started calling in favors, moving fuel allocations and crew rotations around like puzzle pieces, because somebody was going to have to make the fast decision actually work, and that had always been her job more than his. Word moved through the Vanguard the way it always did, not through the official announcement, but corridor to corridor, mess hall to mess hall, until most of the ship knew before Blake's formal order ever came down. A distress call. A dying world. A fleet mobilizing for people who had never heard of Earth and owed it nothing. Not everyone understood it. A junior systems tech grumbled over his tray that humanity had plenty of its own problems without borrowing someone else's war, and for a moment nobody at the table answered him. Then an older deck chief across from him set down her fork and said, quietly, that she'd grown up on stories of a coastal town that flooded once, decades back, while every neighboring district argued for 2 days about whose responsibility the rescue actually was. Nobody in her family ever forgot how that argument ended. The tech didn't say anything else after that. Far more of the crew felt something else entirely. An old, stubborn instinct that didn't much care about jurisdiction, because somewhere out there, someone had asked for help, and the answer had been silence for too long already. getting a fleet from a standing start to full combat readiness in under an hour looks, from the outside, like chaos. Undersecretary Thorne, who had talked his way onto a courier vessel and secured a spot as an official Covenant observer the moment word ched him of what the humans were doing, watched it happen from a shipyard platform, and privately decided it was the most alarming thing he had ever seen. Ships peeled away from dock in staggered bursts, engines flaring as they burned reaction mass to build velocity. A simple, almost old-fashioned idea, throwing mass in one direction to move in the other. The same principle behind every rocket humans had ever built, just running at a scale their ancestors wouldn't have recognized. There was no elegant, silent glide into formation. There was fire and noise, and enormous quantities of fuel spent with what looked, to Thorne's eye, like reckless disregard for cost. And yet, every ship that left dock had somewhere specific to be. Every crew member moving through the corridors moved with purpose. It wasn't chaos, Thorne realized several hours in. It was speed with the padding stripped away. "You seem surprised, Ambassador," said Lieutenant Owen Castellan, the logistics officer assigned to keep Thorne from wandering somewhere he shouldn't. In Covenant space, a mobilization this size would take weeks of review before the first ship undocked, Thorne admitted. "We don't really have that luxury, sir," Castellan said. "Humanity's got a long history of watching help arrive too late. We tend to remember lessons like that pretty vividly." The 4-day burn toward Elowen's reach turned out to be nothing like the tense, silent transit Thorne had braced for. He found the crew trading dry, gallows-humor jokes in the mess hall the night before a battle they knew would be dangerous, bad rations, coolant leaks, whatever was handy. And when he finally asked Castellan whether that struck anyone as disrespectful, the answer surprised him. "It's not that we don't take it seriously," Castellan said. "Staying loose is how a lot of us stay steady. It's not the opposite of fear, it's what you do with it." At their current burn, the fleet was moving fast enough that a physicist would have insisted, technically, that time was passing for them at a very slightly different rate than it was back on Earth. The same relativistic drift that makes satellite clocks need constant correction, just too small a fraction of a second over 4 days to matter to anyone aboard. Thorne found that detail strangely fitting. From where he stood, it was the only part of this entire operation that was moving at a pace he recognized. He secured a private meeting with Blake on the second day, mostly out of professional habit, expecting the kind of guarded, diplomatic non-answers he'd spent a career extracting from reluctant officials. "You could still turn back," Thorne said, watching the Admiral review intelligence reports at his desk. The gesture alone would carry weight from a Covenant perspective, even if the mission proved too difficult to complete. Blake looked up, something almost amused crossing his face. "With respect, Ambassador, a gesture doesn't save anyone's life. Only actually showing up does. Your fleet is operating without support, deep in territory you have no claim to, against an enemy of unknown strength." "Yes. May I ask why? Genuinely. This world owes your species nothing. It has no fleet to offer you, no resources you need, no political favor to trade." Blake set the report down and leaned back, considering the question longer than Thorne expected. "Humanity spent most of its history fighting itself," he said finally. "Got very good at it, and most of what we learned from it wasn't pleasant. But somewhere in there, we also picked up something else. The idea that what a person is really made of doesn't show up in how they treat someone who can do something for them. It shows up in how they treat someone who can't. That world down there can't do a single thing for us. All they had was a voice in the dark hoping somebody would care enough to answer it. If we let a strategic calculation decide whether we respond to that, we've lost something worth a lot more than a battle." Thorne had no immediate answer. He sat with the words for a long moment, measuring them against decades of Covenant doctrine that had never once, in his memory, placed simple compassion above careful calculation. "The Covenant would call that reckless," he said eventually, though the words carried less conviction than they would have a week earlier. "Maybe," Blake agreed. "But I'd rather be called reckless for helping too much than cautious for helping too little too late." On the fourth day, sensors caught the first hard evidence of what waited for them: drifting wreckage, weapons fire still visible on Elowen's surface from orbit. Blake's voice went out over the shipwide comm, calm and utterly without hesitation. "All hands prepare for combat. We're not too late, let's keep it that way." The Korrath Swarm had never encountered anything like the Vanguard's response group, and it showed almost immediately. 6 raider vessels held position in Elowen's orbit, crewed and heavily armored, still pounding what remained of the surface defenses when the human cruisers dropped out of transit and opened fire before the swarm's sensors had finished registering the arrival. 2 raiders were disabled in the opening exchange. A third broke and ran. "Numbers don't favor us as much as we'd like," Finch said, studying the tactical display beside Blake. 6 of theirs against our 3. Their hulls are cruder, but heavier armored than intelligence suggested." "Doesn't matter," Blake said. "We didn't come here to win a fair fight, we came here to stop this." He turned to the comm officer. "Fleet-wide all channels." His voice carried through every ship a moment later. "This is Admiral Blake. We are not here to negotiate, and we are not here to hold back. Every moment we hesitate, more people die down there. Full engagement. I want those raiders destroyed or driven off this system within the hour." What made the Korrath genuinely dangerous wasn't any single ship. It was the coordination hub, a modified command vessel that let every drone in the swarm learn, in something close to real time, from whatever tactic had just failed against it. Hit the swarm the same way twice, and the second attack would find the drones already adjusted, already compensating. It was the same basic pressure that drives change in living systems. A population under constant threat has to keep shifting just to hold its ground, because standing still means falling behind. The Korrath's hub was that principle weaponized. Predictability was the one thing that could actually beat them. Which was exactly why Blake never let his ships settle into a pattern. Formations shifted mid-fight. Firing solutions varied from ship to ship instead of syncing to one tactic. The swarm, built to adapt, simply couldn't adapt fast enough to a fleet that refused to repeat itself. The battle turned ugly in its final minutes, when the last raider, larger than the rest, clearly the flagship, realized it couldn't win and turned its remaining weapons on the surface instead. A final, spiteful act aimed at the people the humans had come to save. Ensign Juno Wilder spotted the opening first. The flagship's coordination hub, the beating heart of the swarm's adaptive tactics, exposed for a narrow window on an approach angle that ran straight through its point defense envelope. "I've got an angle on the hub," she called out. "It's close range. I think I can take it." "That's inside their defensive range," Blake said. "Survivability is low, Ensign." "Understood, sir. Requesting permission anyway." The silence lasted only a second. "Permission granted. Make it count." Wilder's fighter tore through a storm of point defense fire, held its line past every instinct screaming to break off, and put its entire weapons payload into the hub at nearly point-blank range. The explosion didn't just cripple the flagship. It silenced the whole swarm's coordination in an instant, drones going dark or scattering without direction, easy targets for the ships still in the fight. Wilder's own fighter spun wildly at the edge of the blast, alarms screaming, and pulled level with meters to spare. "Nice flying, Ensign," her squadron leader said over the comm, not quite managing to hide the shake in his own voice. "Don't ever do that again." Wilder let out a breathless laugh as she nursed her damaged fighter back toward the vanguard. "No promises, sir." Within the hour, it was over. The last raider surrendered rather than risk destruction, and the debris of the ones that hadn't drifted slowly through Elowen's orbit, scattering light across a sky that had, until that morning, only ever known the soft glow of kelp reefs. On the ground, the change arrived as sudden silence. The shaking stopped, the distant explosions faded, and for the first time in what felt like days, Emrik Thal, pulled from the flooded shaft hours earlier and now recovering in a makeshift medical shelter, heard nothing at all. What followed the battle told the Ithra more about their rescuers than the fight itself ever could. Human medical teams reached the surface within hours, working alongside Ithra rescue crews to pull anyone still trapped behind collapsed struts. The flooded outer concourse, where Emrik had nearly drowned, needed clean water fast, and the fix human engineers rigged was almost embarrassingly simple. A portable reverse osmosis unit, forcing seawater through a membrane fine enough to strip out salt and contaminants under pressure. The same basic principle behind most desalination plants humans had been running back on Earth for generations. It wasn't glamorous. It kept people alive. Dr. Freya Lindqvist ran triage in the largest shelter camp using a color tag sorting system, nearly identical to the one emergency responders had used in human disasters for over a century. A fast, deliberately unsentimental method for deciding, in the first sea, chaotic minutes, who needed help immediately and who could wait, because treating patients in the order they happen to arrive, rather than the order their injuries demand, is one of the surest ways to lose people who didn't have to be lost. None of it had been part of the mission briefing. Blake made the call to stay without consulting anyone beyond his own command staff, And when Finch pointed out that their supplies were built for combat casualties, not an entire city's worth of civilian injuries, his answer was simple: they'd make do and request more from home. An Ithra elder named Salve Marrow, who had spent the battle sheltering the youngest children of the outer concourse in a reinforced storage vault, emerged afterward to find human engineers already stringing power lines across a collapsed walkway, working by portable floodlight because the concourse's own grid was still down. She had never spoken to a human before. She stood watching for a long while before finally asking one of them haltingly why they were rebuilding a stranger's bridge instead of resting after a battle. The engineer, sunburned and exhausted, just shrugged and said someone still needed to get across it in the morning. Emrik found Lindqvist during a quiet moment and asked her, through a translator still struggling with the strangeness of the conversation, why she was still there. The fighting was over. Her mission was done. "Winning the fight doesn't mean the job's finished," she said. "There's still a lot of hurting people down here." He sat with that answer for a long time, turning it over alongside everything else he'd seen over the past several days: the speed of the battle above, the unhesitating decision to stay afterward, all of it offered freely to a world that had nothing to offer in return. It didn't match anything he'd been taught to expect from an outside power showing up uninvited. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he didn't want it to end when the last human ship eventually pulled out of orbit. Undersecretary Calix Thorne's report to the Covenant Council, filed on his return, was unusually blunt for a man who had spent 30 years perfecting careful language. He wrote that he'd expected to witness recklessness, and had instead watched a species commit fully to a decision the instant it mattered, without spending the hours a safer choice would have cost. He wrote that the Covenant's caution had saved lives for centuries, and that he no longer believed caution and speed had to be enemies. Only that most civilizations, his own included, had never been forced to find out otherwise. The report split the council roughly down the middle, the way reports like that always do. Some delegates dismissed it as sentiment. Others took it seriously enough to open a debate about crisis response reform that would run, predictably, for months without resolving anything. Outside the council chambers, the story spread in a simpler shape. A world had called for help. A fleet with no obligation to answer had come anyway, fought until the threat was gone, and stayed until the wounded were cared for and the water ran clean again. It was the kind of story that didn't need embellishing to travel fast. On Elowen's reach, Emrik Thal eventually went back to work rebuilding the same maintenance shaft he'd nearly drowned in, the little emergency beacon still archived among his personal effects. A reminder of how close that call had come to dying unheard, filed away by a distant committee that would have gotten to it eventually, once there was nothing left worth saving. Admiral Blake received a short message from Elowen's newly reformed council before the Vanguard broke orbit for home: gratitude and an invitation to open formal relations. The first the Ithra had ever extended to an outside power. He read it alone in his quarters and sent back only a few lines in reply. "You didn't need to thank us. You needed help and we were close enough to give it. That's all this ever was." Word moved slowly across the wider galaxy, the way it always did, through official channels first, and then through the far faster, far less official network of people simply telling each other what they'd heard. Piece by piece, a reputation built on caution and quiet condescension began shifting into something else. A people who, when a cry for help finally reached them, didn't calculate the cost before answering. Years later, when historians on both sides of the Covenant border tried to pin down exactly when humanity's standing in the galaxy started to change, most of them landed on the same 6 days. The 6 days between a young engineer's flooded shaft and a fleet's arrival in his sky. Not because the battle itself had been so remarkable, though it was, but because of what it proved, that somewhere out past the edge of the dark, there was a species willing to burn every rule in the book the moment someone needed them to. They just answer. They